Hello everyone, it's Tom Slater here. Before we get into this episode of Last Orders, I just want to let you all know that there are still a few signed copies left of Brendan O'Neill's new book, A Heretic's Manifesto, and the only way to get your hands on one of them is by donating £50 or more to Spiked. You'll be able to secure a signed copy of a brilliant book, plus you'll be supporting our work here at Spiked at the same time. You'll also get a whole year's access to Spiked Supporters, our online donor community packed full of exclusive perks. Membership is usually £50 for the whole year anyway, so all in all, it's a hell of a deal. To make your donation, claim your signed copy and claim your Spiked Supporters membership, just go to spiked-online.com/donate. That's spiked-online.com/donate. Thank you, and now on with the show. Welcome to Last Orders, the Spike podcast on all things nanny state. In this episode, we discuss Sadiq Khan's war on cake, why the rise of problem gambling is not all it seems, and what Just Stop Oil really wants. Hello and welcome to Last Orders. I'm Tom Slater, editor of Spiked, joined as I am in every episode by Chris Snowdon from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hello, Chris.
Hello, Tom. It's great to be here in London's glittering East End.
And also delighted to be joined today. His first time on the podcast, James Woudhuysen, Spiked contributor and a visiting professor of forecasting and innovation at London South Bank University. James, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So we're going to talk about a lot today, but we're going to start off with some nanny state topics, Chris. The first of which is TfL's increasingly insane advertising ban where junk food is concerned. People might not even be aware this exists, but this is something that's been in place for a good few years now under Sadiq Khan. Originally, one would assume this was about stopping McDonald's from advertising or Greggs from advertising, stop people getting tempted to get off the train and go and eat something that's bad for them. But it actually extends far beyond that. And the most recent example is probably the most ridiculous yet, involving a picture of a wedding cake in an advert for a West End play. Do you want to tell us a bit more about this and this mental policy?
Certainly. So this has been around since 2018 or 2019. And at the time, I actually wrote something for the Spectator health website, which has since been wiped. So I was quite pleased this story happened because I managed to dig it up and produce it as if it was some new research. But I did an FOI to TfL at the time, asking them how much money they'd spent redesigning their own posters, like their own posters saying the tube is great or get a season ticket or whatever they advertise, And it turned out to be £16,000. And I got all the emails between the creatives at TfL. And it was things like there was a poster that had a biscuit on it for some reason. It had a nice biscuit, and they couldn't use that because it's obviously high in sugar. And then there were a whole load of sort of cartoon maps illustrating each of the lines. And at each stop, it would show you something famous that was there, right? So Baker Street, it would be Sherlock Holmes, whatever. Or if it was Wimbledon, it was maybe strawberries and cream. Well, you couldn't have strawberries and cream because cream's high in sugar. Or it'd be Brick Lane, and that would show a curry. And they went, well, is that going to be high in fat? We don't know, better err on the side of caution and airbrush that out. Numerous things like this. Even people having a picnic in Hyde Park, go, oh, what's in the sandwich? We better airbrush. It was absolutely insane. And all the people you could tell from the emails knew this was insane. And they were kind of laughing about it and going, what are we doing? But that's what the regulations say. And they genuinely do. This wasn't like gold plating from some bureaucrat. The regulations genuinely say you cannot show this stuff. Doesn't matter whether you're advertising or not. You can't show it. So every now and again, you get some absurd story and people go, well, what the hell's going on here? Well, it's just the rules being enforced the way they were designed. Now, call me an ultra-libertarian if you want, Tom. I actually think that if you want to just advertise wedding cake on the tube, you should be free to do that. But in this instance, they weren't even doing that. They were advertising some play or other, which is
Tony and Tina's wedding, apparently.
Right, it was about a wedding, so reasonable enough to use a cake. I think it was splitting in half to imply some sort of fracture in relationship. I don't know much about the play. I don't think it's been very well reviewed. But they got some good publicity here, I suppose. What more can you say? That is the story, and we shall see if we get this on a larger scale when the government brings in its nationwide ban. I think the government actually has learned a little bit from Sadiq Khan's mistakes, and they've kind of narrowed the definition of unhealthy food advertising. But it's, people couldn't believe it really, when this news broke. But they should do. It is ridiculous, and as I say, is it that much more ridiculous than saying you can't advertise cake? I don't think so particularly.
No, not at all.
This is kind of an unintended consequence, but the intended consequences are pretty ridiculous.
I suppose it does show up the extent of the sort of megalomania at play, where it's not even if like the cake is incidental or something, because some of the examples you showed were them advertising that their ticket prices have gone down. So there's like a picture of a cake in the shape of the London Underground logo with a little chunk cut out of it. But we can't have that.
Well, the children's health is at stake here, Tom.
Of course,
that's what you're overlooking.
You do get a peek, don't you, James, into just how paternalistic, how patronising this kind of public health thing is, because it can often seem like, it's just in the background. It's not really necessarily as offensive, but something where you're telling people they can't even get sight of a bit of cake. How did we get to this kind of position where this is considered worthwhile policy for a mayor or anyone else to pursue?
I think when you look at it, you put together the advertising industry, which has always been laughable, and TfL's commitment to the public health agenda, to the woke agenda. At my station, East Putney, they've got a big ad, the first thing you notice when you go in, saying the world is a better place because there's more trans people in it. That's a TfL ad. So their willingness to get off the point of transporting us properly and to discuss other issues where they see themselves as using advertising to enforce social policy is really remarkable. And we're talking about an organization that a few years back, they had a lovely big poster on the tube of Gandhi, the Indian leader. And the quote was, "There is more to life than simply increasing its speed," from TfL. How very convenient, because basically they want you to walk and cycle like the government does, like Labour does, and the speed of the trains, or indeed the train announcements. I got to a station today, and they said, "Well, everybody, please leave the station. There's an emergency," and everybody started leaving the station, and then they said, "This is just a test."
Really?
Right? Yeah. So their willingness to not to do the business, but to use media to get off the point, to confuse people, to explore other missions.
Now, was this like a fire drill or something? Was there an alarm as well?
Like you could induce panic in a situation.
Yeah, was just one guy with a microphone having a laugh?
No, it was.
I thought you were going to say they were ushering everyone outside for a pride parade or something, like just with the setup that you gave it. But you never know.
It was a noontime thing, and in fact, I then realised I was a chump because everybody was leaving the station because they were leaving anyway, not because they were obeying the announcement. But I felt duty bound to obey it, and their willingness to make 3 simultaneous announcements on the tube, on the platform, and then another one shows that their concern for passenger information, their concern for passenger speed, their concern for just delivering a proper service often takes second place to their social agenda.
And it's interesting as well, because obviously we started off talking about the nanny state stuff, the public health stuff, the food stuff, but also one of Sadiq Khan's kind of headline policies when he first came in was banning essentially sexist ads. Everyone remember the Beachbody Ready controversy, which I think was in the run-up to him becoming mayor. It was this bizarrely large controversy where you had these Beachbody Ready adverts. There were protests at the time, I remember. You felt like we were on the cusp of everything going a bit mad, even back then.
What if that woman had been obese? Can you advertise obese women on the...
It seems like it.
I don't see it's not a clear direction here from TfL. They're trying to stop obesity, but at the same time, they're banning images of thin people. Is it okay to advertise a fat woman in a bikini? If you, I don't know why you would do that, but
if you wanted to,
a large-size bikini company, or something.
If you wanted to,
that'd be all right. So you can encourage obesity like that. Well, the thing you can't encourage people to be thin.
I dare say it's not particularly well thought through or particularly consistent. I mean, one thing that they had, it just got to a point where they were getting rid of advertisements that had any kind of whiff of female nudity in them. There was one advert for tights, I think, where there was a nude woman's back, just her back. So they ended up having to draw a top on in order to cover that up. So that was a case a few years ago. So it just ended up, it wasn't particularly well.
It's not quite puritanical. It's entirely puritanical. You wonder what they had for breakfast, these people. It couldn't have been sugar. Can't be fruit because that's got sugar. But something is giving them the energy to want to clamp down and ban anything that takes their fancy, whether it's food or anything else. And I wonder how they got their jobs.
It is very entertaining as well, reading your Substack, Chris, where you relay all of these emails between these different TfL executives where they're having to decide, right, this picture's got a snowman and it's about air conditioning, but he's holding an ice cream, so let's wipe out the ice cream. Like, you would think they would all look at each other at a point like that and think, what the hell?
I think they did. I got the impression that they did. They were just following orders, you know.
Yeah.
Wiping the ice cream out from your article cost £1,500. I mean, that is how ludicrous advertising is. To take something out.
Oh yeah, they charge top dollar, don't they?
It's ridiculous. Chris, should we also talk about gambling? It's been it's been back in the news recently, because I think this is something that we've been covering on the podcast over the years. This kind of increasing drumbeat towards clampdowns on gambling. There's a lot of concern. Originally, it was about fixed odd betting terminals, particularly online gambling. But there was a story this week about the NHS opening more gambling clinics, which you could be against that. But in your write-up of it, you also kind of point out the fact that a lot of these claims around the extent of problem gambling aren't really what they seem. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about this?
Well, the problem gambling rate has been measured in this country pretty much every year certainly since 2007, and several surveys going back to 1999. And it has always been at a really low level. It has always been about 0.4, 0.5%. I think the current rate is about 0.3%, essentially static, completely static, all through that period, all through the period where we had the legalization of gambling advertising, we had the rise of online gambling, we had the arrival of fixed odds betting terminals, we had the de facto banning of fixed odds betting terminals. None of this seemed to really make any difference to the problem gambling rate, which is really low and is low by international standards. You know, they do this quarterly survey, the Gambling Commission. They survey 4,000 people. They typically find about 13 of them who are problem gamblers. This is why it's got quite weak statistical significance, because there's so few problem gamblers. You have to survey a huge number to get a reliable figure. So it's a low rate, but because there's always agitation against gambling, it obviously helps the activists if they can pretend that things are getting worse. And one of the ways they're doing that now, because we've got more and more problem gambling clinics opening up, which, as you say, is a good thing. And you know, cognitive behavioral therapy in particular really does work for dealing with problem gambling. So it's good that people have increasing access to these clinics. But one of the very obvious and predictable consequences of giving people more access to the clinics is more people go to them, which you would think is the whole point of opening up more clinics, right? And so this story last week was along the lines of number of people seeking help for gambling reaches record high. Well, it's going to keep hitting record highs, I would hope, for some time until they stop opening new clinics. There was only one about 15 years ago in London, and there's now about 8. They plan to open another 7, and it would be quite disappointing if we don't get more and more people going to these things. And it's good that people are going to them. The actual number, by the way, of people last year who did go to one of these clinics, it was only like 1,300. Which I worked out was 2 per clinic per week. So they're hardly being overwhelmed with people seeking help for gambling addiction. I dare say there's some unmet need there still, but it's a very, very small proportion of the population who show signs of problem gambling, let alone looking for help for it. So it was just another silly way to try and get the issue in the news. And the BBC's report and all the other reports really they mentioned this supposedly shocking claim that problem gambling clinics are seeing more people than ever, and immediately got onto, and that's why we need to do something about advertising and sponsorship and stakes and online and this and that. And it just never ends.
And especially because one would have thought that, first of all, with the rise of online gambling and that being a relatively loosely regulated sort of space.
Well, it was. Speaking. It's a bit more regulated now, but yeah.
Something that still people could access relatively easily.
Oh, yeah, they can access
that plus the pandemic, you would think you would see, but just nothing. Just the rate is more or less.
It's actually gone down since the pandemic, actually, a little bit. I mean, we're talking tiny figures, but it looks like it's gone down from about 0.5% to 0.3%. Which in absolute terms is the difference between there being 400,000 problem gamblers and 250,000 problem gamblers, if you trust those figures. But yeah, certainly the claims that were made in the early days of lockdown that there was going to be this epidemic of online gambling and no one can seek help and people have got nothing else to do and there'll be nobody looking over their shoulder. None of that came to pass at all. I mean, most of the things we talk about in this show, the smoking and drinking and so on, it often did get worse during lockdown. Certainly drinking got a lot worse during lockdown, and obesity rose a lot during lockdown. But problem gambling didn't, for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm. James, what do you make of all this? Do you think this will be the next kind of front in the public health
Well, I think,
fight?
I'm pleased that Christopher supports these clinics because, as the BBC is always telling us, problem gambling is a real problem. I mean, it does exist to a certain extent. You only have to look at Andrew Bailey's management of the Bank of England to know how problematic it can become. I think if you're a family member of somebody who's really got a problem with it, it's very, a bit like alcoholism. It's no fun. There's no doubt about it. I think what strikes me is, and it's very much of a piece with the TfL thing, is that the people who make gambling a sort of cause have this enormous disdain for errant working class people. To go into a betting shop is for them, to enter the gates of Hades. It just shows a degenerate character, and the desire to repress that is, way bigger than the actual incidence of the problem. And for people who are problem gamblers, then of course, a bit like mental health, if you generalize it to the extent that the authorities do, then the genuine cases of, what they call addiction, will be sort of muddied over, as we are all problem gamblers now. And that's a big mistake.
Yeah, there is a real move at the moment in public health. Now that gambling is being perceived as a public health issue, it's been kind of officially moved into the health area. There is a very conscious attempt now to problematize all gambling. And to say the solution here, as with alcohol, actually, is
no safe levels.
No safe level. Right. The ideal amount of gambling, just like alcohol, is zero, and we should try and bring down rates of gambling rather than problem gambling down across the entire population. And that means the usual ineffective nanny state policies like advertising bans, like trying to put the price up, which you can't actually do with gambling, but the public health people haven't kind of noticed that yet. But yeah, the usual top-down, killjoy, counterproductive policies. They are, and they increasingly will be used in this area because they are just trying to, as always, they're just copying what they did with smoking. They haven't got any other frame of reference.
Yes.
And it's interesting as well, as you were saying, James, the kind of the class prejudice which seems to drive it. Because you read the writing about this and it's full of it, and the kind of talk, it's all over football shirts. And there was a time when that people were constantly railing against the arrival of betting shops on high streets, which they seem to object to on largely aesthetic grounds as much as anything else. These horrible places full of horrible people and lino and,
25% of them have closed in the last few years.
There we go, another unspoken of victim of our current economic downturn.
No, it's the property thing, the entirely fixed betting terminal thing. Yeah. I mean, the bookie said a lot of them will close. And the campaigner said, no, they won't. People will just go back to putting money on the dogs and horses. And it's like, no, I don't think so. I think the times have changed. Although we were right. Completely.
Although it is worth saying that if we're talking about class, it does take all kinds. There was a very strange piece in The Guardian recently about one of their writers getting hooked on gambling by gambling on Wimbledon. So it does take its middle class forms as well, this particular unfortunate social disease. But should we take a complete turn and talk about something completely different, which is environmentalism and how it's kind of holding up in the midst of the cost of living crisis, I suppose, James? Something that this is an issue, the question of energy, the question of energy policy that you've been writing about a lot for us. And I think the Labour Party in particular have been having a bit of difficulty trying to orient themselves in the midst of all of this. Of course, they made a lot of headlines when in recent months they really tried to present themselves as a thoroughly green party. They were going to do 28 billion annual capital investment in terms of green projects. Of course, there's the ban that they've proposed on all new oil and gas exploration in the North Sea. But since then, you've started to see them demur a little bit to respond to backlash, both from the newspapers and from industry. You had Keir Starmer being quoted in the newspapers over the weekend saying he hates tree huggers and he'll just cuss out Just Stop Oil at any possible situation. So what's going on here with the Labour Party, do you think? Are they seeing sense, or is this just a case of them having to moderate themselves slightly in terms of their messaging on all this?
I don't think it's either of those, Tom. I think, we'd all like to think that eventually a note of realism in a high interest rate, high inflation rate, cost of living crisis kind of Britain, we'd like to think that Labour or everybody would sort of start to see sense. But we get an impression of just how far off they are from that when you read the Times report about Keir Starmer saying he hates tree huggers. Sober figures in the Labour Party are saying, yes, we want to be with Rachel Reeves on all of this green stuff. We don't want Ed Miliband. We want we want to follow Joe Biden on the Inflation Reduction Act. Well, any cursory inspection of the Inflation Reduction Act shows that if you want to follow Joe Biden on that, you're going to be green through and through and to the core. So the alternative that's presented of the unions, Starmer, Reeves, and other electorally savvy figures who don't want to be tarred with the Just Stop Oil brush, the story of them sort of now controlling the Labour Party just doesn't stack up. The Labour Party has been, for many years, utterly imbued with environmentalism. It's got no other ideas. If you ask me exactly what Starmer's policy was on the economy or Reeves's, I wouldn't be able to answer. I don't think anybody can. But there's one thing that they do distinguish themselves by. It's this commitment to green policies that they've not thought out, that they've not quantified, that they're very ignorant about. They're ignorant about the energy, the physics, the whole lot. But that's the differentiating factor. It is with the Democrats in the United States as well. So they're not going to shuffle off the green coil anytime soon. Definitely not.
I mean, it's interesting as well how him making these comments about tree huggers, or Rachel Reeves saying we'll make the 28 billion an aspiration, something, rather than something that we'll do from day one, is seen as such a big change in position. It just shows you how narrow, if that's the right expression, the kind of Overton window is on these questions in terms of party politics. Because you have the Tories who are constantly trying to kind of grimace and shake their fists at Just Stop Oil or the Labour Party or whatever. But again, as you were sort of suggesting, that's really a question of quite minute degrees between them. But do you think anything could actually make just British politics in general kind of wake up to the fact that the policies that have been pursued for so long in terms of quote unquote green energy are just on a hiding to nothing? I mean, if this cost of living crisis and the war and so on can't do it, can anything sort of shake them out of this?
Well, I think, it's important not to be alarmist about power cuts. It's certainly important not to believe the hype about electric cars that, they are selling in such numbers and will take over so much of the stock on Britain's roads that they're all going to blow the national grid anytime soon. The national grid may blow, but it's got nothing to do with electric vehicles. It's because they haven't planned the capacity properly, and they haven't planned the fossil fuel backup for all the renewables we've been installing. So the mistake has been to imagine that we can start again with this absolutely fruitless policy, which nobody can afford, of electric vehicles. What will be the tipping point? Could be the extension of ULEZ at the end of August. I think it's the 29th. It could be power cuts come the winter. It could be a number of things that really are the straw that broke the cliche, that alert everybody to the fact that we've been living in cloud cuckoo land policy-wise about energy. So we've got to be alert to all of that. Things won't be blown by electric cars. They're more likely to be blown by white van man not being able to get into London and taking it out on Just Stop Oil people.
Yeah, they're dreadful. Well, you wrote a very good piece about this, Tom. Yeah,
I did. It makes it sound like I asked you to tee that up.
No,
I didn't. But no, well, it's one thing about Just Stop Oil, which was always quite irritating to me, was that whether it was members of the Labour Party, less so these days, but still, or generally the great and good, they would say things like their heart's in the right place, or Andy Murray last week ahead of the tournament starting saying that
I agree with the cause, but I don't agree with the methods.
That wasn't a clip, that was actually Kristen in press. But yes, exactly. So but I don't think people, this is why I wrote the piece, I don't think people realise what these people actually believe. So Roger Hallam, who's the guy who looks a bit like Charles Manson, who's their sort of
Not just
ringleader.
looks like him, similar in many respects.
There's a helter-skelter aspect to them in general, but he was also a co-founder of Extinction Rebellion. And if you look at what he's said and written, it's crackers. And it's incredible that anyone would ever say, I support the cause but not the tactics. So he's explicitly said he wants a kind of lockdown style society, albeit with a bit more freedom, which is nice. So you can meet each other and organise politically, as he put it. He wants a ban on all non-essential consumption, kind of Mark Drakeford mid-COVID style, I guess. All cars would go flying. Then there's authoritarianism. There's a fascinating video he put out called, I think it was Dominic Lawson Will Be Hanged for Climate Crimes, is the name of it, or something to that effect, in which he basically holds a mock trial of Lawson.
This is the violence thing that people like to do.
Yeah, it's really creepy. And he has this big disclaimer at the beginning, which is that this is a prediction that he's going to be hanged and he's going to have a trial.
Is he the worst one, Dominic Lawson, as far as I'm concerned?
Apparently so. He comes up a lot, doesn't he?
Not even Nigel Lawson. I suppose Nigel Lawson's dead, doesn't
No, exactly. No
Can't hang him twice.
And then, of course, there's the other thing, which is a bit better known now, which is this really creepy video he did called something like A Message to Young People as They Face Annihilation, in which he lays out this kind of
It's a strong title.
Mad Max hellscape, in which he says, let me tell you the reality of the climate crisis. I'm only slightly paraphrasing here, is that young men will break into your house, grab your mother or your girlfriend and rape them in front of you, and then push your eyes out of a hot stick.
Mm.
So this is the person who, when Andy Murray says, I support the cause but not the tactics,
Right.
is who they're talking about. So just bear that in mind, listeners, when you see them blocking a road. They're not just irritating, they're mental.
Yeah, hate the cause and hate the people. Dreadful. Although the one thing I'd like to say about Roger Hallam, which not enough people know, is he was radicalised by attempting to be an organic farmer. I think he was just like a normal white collar worker, and then he decided to sort of do a good life kind of thing, and he dropped out and bought a few acres and tried to become an organic farmer, but because he didn't use any pesticides, all his crops died, and he blamed it on climate change.
Very good. Well, I wonder if I just to set a hair running, what strikes me about the zeal of all these 60-something women who were arrested on Just Stop Oil protests is that, where do they get this zeal from? It's
I'm watching videos of him saying that men break into your house.
I'm not sure that's true. You see, I think...
But if you believe that stuff, you probably would do things like that.
Yeah, but
walking would seem quite a moderate thing to do if you believe that this is what's actually going to happen.
I think their inspiration is more to do with Sidney and Beatrice Webb, and who are the Fabian founders of the Labour Party.
Lovers,
the great Stalin lovers. Well, what they liked about Stalin and what the Webbs were always after was efficiency. Efficiency in the civil service, efficiency in administration, efficiency in the economy. And I think if you take the middle-class 60-something home counties vision, where a lot of these protesters are, they are made angry by the waste that they see around them, by their desire to cull the population a little bit, to everybody to stop eating this sugar, stop using the oil, let's organize the planet, according to streamlined, careful administrators, basically us. It is very Webbian, if you'll forgive the phrase. It sort of it's a crusading mission to bring rationality, they believe, to life, when you and I know they're bringing exactly the opposite. So I think it's that interventionist tradition from the British middle class that they draw upon from the 20th century more than the loony videos of Roger Hallam.
I suppose one thing that's interesting, this touched on what you were saying, Chris, was that in a sense, they are the ones who are just taking a quite mainstream environmental kind of apocalypticism to its logical conclusion. You often hear them say, we're told constantly by Greenpeace or by whoever that the world's going to hell in a handcart. Then why are they just asking for our £5 a month and to, do these meager little actions? So in a sense, they are kind of calling the bluff of the politicians of the mainstream environmental movement, of saying, you've been saying that it's code red for humanity for the past 30, 40 years now.
And nothing's happened.
Aren't you acting like it?
Yeah.
So in a way, it is remarkable that they only do go as far as lying down in the...
They are all very posh. I mean, it's inverted snobbery, I suppose. But they are all called things like, Phoebe Scuttlebutt, Cumberly Smythe, and Indigo Rumbelow. That's a genuine one, isn't it? Indigo Rumbelow.
Edred Whittingham. That was a good one.
I mean, it's almost beyond parody, isn't it?
And it's
like a
straight out
P.G. Woodhouse.
It's a lot of young kind of Goldsmith student style kids with ridiculous names. And then Vickers is another type. And then women of a certain age, as you were suggesting.
But I also know just Gary Lineker, Andy Murray said, I agree with the cause. I don't like the disruption. Gary Lineker said, no, I do like the disruption. I want more of it. It's quite remarkable, really.
And we should say it's not even just a smear that they're all really middle class. It's like an objective academic fact.
That is a fact.
They actually studied like a bunch of Extinction Rebellion people who ended up going through court after their first Action back in 2018, 2019, and it was 85% of them had a university degree or something like that. The typical Extinction Rebellion person was a young, well-to-do woman from the southeast, essentially with a good degree, which perfect.
Yeah, the people who have just missed out on, in many cases, I suspect, some sort of role in the theatre, something like that. You know, the musicians or actresses who didn't quite make the grade despite going to public school and now feel very bitter towards the world.
Well, that thespian performative aspect of them is very important. And again, very British in 20th century. You know,
that 12th century, a lot, isn't it?
Right, shall we get some postbag questions
please.
in? Where our listeners send in their questions, we try to answer them.
Postbag.
It's bulging, eh?
Got one here for James Woudhuysen from Simon. Hello,
ideal, because he's here.
Exactly, finally. We've been sitting on this for months. No, so James, should governments ban deep sea mining for metals and minerals from the ocean seabed?
Well, a really interesting question because, you know, this afternoon we've talked a lot about bans on cakes and everything else. And it's a common prejudice, reflected always by the BBC, that technology is moving faster than the law and the regulation and so on. And there's something in it, but there's James's law on top of that, which says panic about technology moves faster than the technology. You get the panic before you get the technology. In the case of deep sea mining, there are all these campaigns that have sprung up to stop it, to stop going after green minerals there for electric cars, to stop going after fossil fuels, and so on. But there's no deep sea mining yet around the world. We have mapped the land surface of the world. We know very little about the seas. We don't know about the CO2 and the mixing of oceans with CO2 that is an essential part of climate change. We are only discovering all the creatures that are at the bottom of the Mariana Trench and everywhere else. If you look at that investigation of the Titanic and how disastrously that all ended, you know, our power against the sea has grown, is substantial, but the sea is, you know, quite a force, quite an enemy of mankind in some ways, despite all its munificence. So really what's happening there is that we're just scratching the surface of the seabed. And we've also learned, haven't we, that coral reefs have not actually collapsed near Australia, that they've revived and so on. So there's much to learn. The desire to ban this mining before it's even happened, there are about 20 or 30 licenses that have been put out for it by countries like Canada and so on. And no doubt it will start. But the furore around it and the ignorance of the seas and the ignorance of the fact that there isn't any mining at the moment is very striking. So ban first, ask questions later. That's really what it reveals.
As it always is, unfortunately. Chris, there's a question here for you, which I think you might have already answered on Twitter, but for the benefit of our listeners. Tuppence Worth wants to know if you have any thoughts about a US study finding that being overweight but not obese carried a slightly lower risk of dying than people with an ideal weight.
Yeah, I haven't seen this one, but
the claim's been made before.
It's not. Yeah, many times been made before, and I always the public health people come down like a ton of bricks on whoever has dared say it. There's a researcher in America who used to work for the CDC called Catherine Flegel. She did a meta-analysis, which is a study of studies, some years ago, which pretty comprehensively showed this. Not only showed that overweight people live longer than people of a so-called healthy weight, but actually there wasn't really any increased risk even for people who were a bit obese, BMI of 30 to 35. And, she was only collating the data that was already out there. It wasn't like she set up some study and rigged it in some way. She was just saying, well, this is what the combined evidence shows. And the Twinkie tax type people in America, the soda tax people, Barry Popkin, they actually held a symposium in which she was just systematically denounced.
It was just devoted to her.
It was just devoted to slagging off her study. And they put out a press release to the media saying, no one should pay any attention to this. It's a load of rubbish. Which is not really a very, scientific way of looking at this. Obviously, it might have been wrong. It's quite possible that all the epidemiology is wrong for some reason. But that's what the evidence showed. And this is what apparently this new one showed. it is not news, really. It's a bit like, a study comes out showing moderate drinking is good for you. People go, wow, this is amazing. It's like, well, this is like literally the 500th study to have shown this, but it just keeps getting ignored by people in public health because they don't like the message.
It's been known for some years that if you're...
It feels like a kind of, if not an old wives' tale, but it's like the sort of thing that you hear around, that actually it's like drinking a little bit there's nothing wrong with that.
Well, if you're in your 70s or 80s and you're too thin, it's not a good place to be. Yeah. You're going to be more feeble, more frail. You're going to have more falls. And when you do have a fall, the bones, it's all...
No cushioning.
No cushioning. So, you want to have a bit of flab when you're old. That's the right thing to do, especially in winter.
With them energy prices as well. James, one last question before we go. We're taking to asking, because this is quite an anti-ban libertarian podcast, but if you did have to ban one thing, what would it be? And it can't be like a worthy thing. You can't ban war or famine or...
Yeah. I think Channel 4 is a very good candidate.
Ooh, tell me more.
But, well, because it's tasteless, because it's loves to say that it's born risky. I'm only kidding. I'm for the freedom of the press, especially for people I really hate.
But if you could have one example, one exception.
Well, I think if you take housing, I'm in favour of regulation that did exist until Margaret Thatcher abandoned it, establishing minimal surface areas for a flat or a house to enjoy. I think we have the smallest houses in Europe, the smallest flats in Europe, and it just isn't good for health, including mental health, to be confined in the tiny and poorly made accommodation that too many Brits enjoy. So it was called Parker Morris, the old legislation. And I think its abandonment is a great shame. Not because I'm a big fan of all regulation, but because the right regulation, when there's a case to answer, and there is in Britain's dilapidated housing stock, the right regulation is something to go for. I don't have a problem with that.
So that was your worthy example, James.
Yeah.
I'm going to take Channel 4 as your actual...
That's right.
answer. That's perfectly good. Great, Chris, James, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Last Orders. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please do take a moment to leave us a rating and a review. And if you'd like to support the show, why not become a Spiked supporter? Just go to spiked-online.com/supporters to sign up. That's spiked-online.com/supporters.